Okay, looks like we're live. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. Want to make sure that audio and video is coming through. Okay, we'll get started here in just a few minutes. Okay, looks like we're live. We'll get started here. Okay, looks like we are good to go. Okay. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. 1 second. If you are joining us, feel free to leave comments in the chat. I'll be trying to periodically visit the chat to field any questions throughout the broadcast, but I wanted to get through some of the content that I had scheduled for today. But feel free to leave comments in the chat and YouTube if you're watching this via the YouTube live stream. This is going to be an uncut version, so I'm actually recording this for a podcast audio only, so we'll probably, I'm sure we'll have to go back and clean it up a little bit, but this is going to be just the uncut version and obviously the video version. So again, if you are joining us, feel free to leave comments in the chat, and I'll try to dip in and out throughout the broadcast to field any questions you have. Certainly we'll look at those questions at the end. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is In the Classroom. I'm Benjamin Stewart at benjaminlstewart.org. Today I wanted to talk about thinking about learner awareness, what we can do as instructors, as teachers, facilitators, coaches. How can we make our learners more aware of the areas in which they need to improve? What started me thinking about this idea was a recent chat I had with Star Sackstein, and my apologies for mispronouncing your name, Star. But I had a very good dialogue, good exchange in Twitter based on a recent post that she uploaded to Education Week Teacher. This is an article that's titled PSA: When giving feedback, don't lead with I love or I like. So if you haven't already, take a look at this. It's a really insightful post. It's dated April 21st, 2019. And a lot of great information, mainly looking at the importance of providing really good constructive feedback to our learners. And in this particular example, she's taking a learner who's developing an essay and even begins the blog post by including a video of a screenshot of a Google Docs where the student first begins the assignment by creating or providing a reflection. And within that reflection, the students are asked to include areas in which they need to improve on, areas in which they are actually requesting their instructor to look at and provide specific types of feedback based on certain aspects of their writing, based on what they talked about prior in class, maybe even based on standards. And so they are very much in tune to what specific areas of their writing that they want to work on, and again receive that type of feedback from the instructor. So I think this is a really good idea. I think having this this type of reflection even before the fact, before they create the essay, is something very important, and really the main focus of what I want to kind of get into a little bit later here in a few minutes. But let me go on to explain a little bit more about what STAR is currently doing. So in this example, again, this is all being recorded, and you can see the actual feedback that STAR is providing as comments along the side as annotations of the text. So after the student includes a reflection, they begin developing the essay. And so you can see here, and STAR goes through and explains very well kind of her thought processes behind what she's doing. I'd like to play just the first 15 seconds here as she kind of sets up this assignment. She sets it up quite well. And I'll go ahead and play just the first 15 seconds here of her kind of getting into this type of exercise.
When providing feedback for students, it's essential that we read their reflections first. In this way, we're able to show students that we are paying attention to what they feel they're working on, and then very specifically give them the feedback that they're asking for.
So I think, again, this is the point here that I want to make, and really some of the questions, actually the central question that I'm thinking about when I came across this article and had a conversation with STAR via Twitter was, how do instructors help learners become more aware of their errors, but thinking in terms of helping students get to this point where, first of all, they're open enough to share their work and feedback from their instructor publicly. So I know that STAR mentioned that she had waivers signed by all the students, granting her permission to share all this information openly. So the first thing is getting to a point where students have that level of confidence, and then second, obviously, the instructor having the level of confidence to actually share and reflect and share this, the way in which they are, in this case, giving feedback, opening up their practice in a way that, that others can benefit. So I think that both from the student and instructor standpoint, this idea of transparency, I think, is very important. But I'm really curious about how we get to a point where students are not only insightful enough to specifically articulate the types of errors that they need to work on, or the areas of their performance that they need to improve upon, but how do we get to that level of reflection and then openness to share? Obviously, there's a lot of day-to-day activities that are going to be needed in order to reach this level of transparency. And I think this is kind of the basis of my question about how do we get to this point where students are have this level of confidence and have this level of insight into their own work. Now, in my case, I keep thinking about teachers that I work with, pre-service and in-service teachers, teacher trainers that I deal with on a daily basis. And in English language teaching and learning, we have this added challenge, maybe. I don't know if it's an additional challenge, but I certainly one that maybe quote-unquote native speakers don't need to deal with in the same way. And that is having teachers and learners who are learning another language have the level of confidence to share their progress, share their performances openly online. And so I think that, and I'm assuming that these learners are quote-unquote native speakers. I'm going to use the term native and non-native very loosely. I'm not a big fan of using the term anyway, but just for the sake of clarity, or I guess not even clarity, I should say, mainly just looking at it to make it a little bit easier to communicate and distinguish between the two types of learners. But I'm curious if these learners were native or non-native speakers. And I'm also curious what others think about what approaches would be similar and perhaps different when you have learners who are either native or non-native speakers. And so I think that whenever we are asking our English language learners to do this, to share their progress openly online, and even as teachers, if I'm a teacher and I'm a non-native speaker, am I going to have the same level of confidence to share this information? And of course, I think it's very important to state at this point that I think anybody would, let me back up. I think regardless of your level, if you have an interest in your teaching and you provide this type of transparency in your own teaching, that there's always going to be someone who can benefit from you sharing in this way. And so I think that's the big takeaway that I get from this, and the message that I want to send to those English language teachers out there, that I think it's very important to try to reach this level of transparency in your own teaching. But let's get back to one of the key aspects here that I wanted to talk about. What happens when an instructor detects more serious goals that go beyond maybe the stated learning objectives of the learner? So let me explain what I mean by this. So when I was looking at this example and I'm reflecting on my own teaching, and I go through a student's written work, I'm looking at obviously things that we've talked about in class. I may not have asked the students to write out a specific reflection that's geared towards a particular essay or a product, but it's certainly things that we've talked about enough as a class and individually that basically everything that I provide in the feedback, it's something that we've talked about at length in our face-to-face classes. But I think that when we get to a point, I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is when we see a product, when we see a written document like this, and we're going through and we've agreed that we're only going to make comments on areas of their performance that they requested, that they mentioned in the reflection, what happens when there is some sort of error that maybe was not included in the student's reflection? Maybe it's an error that we feel is even more important, more serious than perhaps some of the errors that the students asked for us to look at in the reflection. What happens in that case? So I think when we look at this, again, it's going to depend a lot on where this particular essay, in this particular example that Star shared in her blog, where the students are in the process of writing. I'm going to assume that this is towards the end of the writing process. So this is, I guess, maybe towards the end of them finishing up their essay, but I'm not really sure. If you're looking at this type of process type of writing, and you're looking at when to and how to address these types of errors and help the learners become more aware of the types of errors that they should be focusing on, because again, it's going to depend very much on the student. Every student's going to be different, and each student may have different areas that they need to work on, and that will be reflected in their reflection for each of their assignments. So what happens when there's a type of error that's serious, and maybe this is something that needs to be addressed more in the face-to-face contact, maybe activities that led up to the students writing these essays, and other types of activities that enable them to have the level, skill, and the knowledge that is necessary to draft an essay like this. Maybe these types of things need to be addressed more beforehand. But that is, I think, one of the questions that I have, and one of the things that I would like other teachers to think about and maybe comment on, either with their colleagues, or certainly I would love to hear how others think about this. But making this distinction between the types of errors and gearing the students, preparing them enough in order for them to, again, reflect on the types of errors that they need to work on, And, you know, maybe the answer is, well, if they are only reflecting on more maybe local errors or errors that are not as serious, maybe you begin the conversation there, and then later on in a subsequent conversation, you try to gear them towards other types of errors that are more serious in nature. And so I see this very much as a kind of a cycle, as going through the writing process, you know, brainstorming and outlining, organizing one's ideas, finding good sources, learning how to find valid and reliable, unbiased sources that support one's ideas. And as they are drafting their work, trying to help them become aware again of the types of errors that need to be committed. I teach a lot of writing classes in our BA, and there's always this back and forth, I think, between some of the errors. I think prioritizing is the word I want to use, is like, what types of errors do they need to be focusing on, right? And so for me, there are certain errors that are more problematic than others. And a lot of what I discuss with my students is helping them become aware of which errors are more serious, which errors tend to interfere with the meaning of what they want to say versus others that are less, have less of an impact on the overall meaning. And so part of that is helping them become aware of that. And I see that this idea of creating a reflection before the assignment, before the essay in this case, which I think is a great idea, having this, all of these day-to-day activities lead and help prepare them to come up with a good reflection, again, that is looking at the types of errors that the student needs to address. I noticed that in this particular example, it looked like the student also linked to certain standards. And yeah, I have all kinds of questions about that. I'm curious about how that unfolds, how the students lead to this, because I even see it as a separate paragraph. So I'm curious how the students themselves and how the instructors facilitate this process of awareness with the learners, how they come together and articulate and express the areas that they need to focus on in terms of standards, if that makes sense. But since I don't work with standards per se in my particular context, I can't speak too much about that, but certainly would love to hear from others about how they deal with that, specifically how that compares with the rest of the reflection, which is geared more towards their own areas where they need to improve. And again, my question here is, how do we align students, help them prioritize the types of errors that they are to include in the reflection? And what do instructors do in the moment of looking at someone's work, regardless of where they are in the process? What do they do when they see maybe other types of errors that they think are more serious, but because this agreement was made that they're only going to comment on errors that the students included in the reflection, how do instructors choose to resolve that issue? And again, for me, I think obviously it has something to do with how they're dealing with their day-to-day activities, their day-to-day conversations they're having with their students, but certainly curious to see how that takes place. I'll go ahead, and the rest of this video basically Star talks about how she went about correcting the essay, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you take a look at this. But I will skip to the end. I think she has some closing thoughts that are interesting, so we'll go ahead and jump to that right now.
Of the fact that Gregor dies alone. And this is another way he could have brought the message wide. When we are reading student papers, it's essential that we adjust the lens that we're using for every single student. It can't just be I'm looking for A, B, and C in every single paper, go through it and move on, give the same feedback to every student. Since every child is going to be working on different things, we want to encourage them to set goals and then give them appropriate feedback based on the goals that they've set. As we move forward with this particular student, what I will do is ask him now to review the feedback I've left him on his paper and set new goals for the next paper based on the stuff that he's improved upon and based on the stuff that he needs to continue to work on.
Yeah, I think this is a great idea, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud how this might play out as students move from assignment to assignment, as they move in and out of different types of errors and ways of improving their own performance, having some sort of learning plan, whether students maintain it themselves or whether or not, but how do they keep track of over time this development, these different types of errors that they were working on and improved upon over time. I'm curious also how they share these learning processes, these learning plans with their classmates, maybe even with others, maybe outside the class. Since a lot of this is already open, it seems like that students have agreed to make their learning open. What other aspects of their development are also open to the public? And I think these are high school students, so I guess questions about how the parents feel about it would also be, I think, interesting. And I'm asking because I don't know. I don't have this experience of teaching high school and teaching in the United States. And so questions like standards and how parents feel about it, et cetera, even school policy with regard to the level of transparency. Certainly I'm throwing these points out there. So if anyone wants to provide some feedback, I would love to hear that. In this blog post or this article from Star, there's a couple of points here that I'd like to address to kind of finish up today's topic. And she mentions here that it's always a good idea to ask the person looking for feedback what it is they need or what they need from the instructor before they start. So again, this is kind of reinforcing this idea of setting up a reflection, writing it out before they do the performance, in this case, write the essay. This is exceptionally true with adult learners. Now, for me, when I hear this, I'm also thinking very much in terms of English language learners, where there's another piece to this puzzle that includes English level proficiency and how one views their own identity as English speakers or speakers of an additional language in general. All right, so I think this is also another important component to the mix of all of the complexities of helping our learners become more aware and how this happens, what kind of agreements are made, and how do we help them gain confidence in order for them to be able to share their work with others. She goes on by saying, never allow a person to say, is this good? That will never serve either of you. It'll never serve either of you. Ask for something more specific. Okay, and then she goes on to say, students teach them how. So I'm assuming children. If it's children, we need to teach them how to do that. Adults, ask for clarifying questions. If I'm teaching a pre-service English language teacher who is also an English language learner, then it might even be a combination of both teaching them how and asking questions to clarify. So I think that for those who are teaching additional languages, I think this is really important. I think also helping learners gain the confidence to share and then have teachers and educators feel that they are open enough to also share their own teaching practice. I think that's a great thing. I think if more teachers did this, more more educators would have more nuanced conversations and more detailed insights into how we can help facilitate our student learning and help them achieve, the course outcomes, their own personal outcomes, and really looking at this idea of reflection in terms of keeping it within the course syllabus, and also keeping it at an individual level so that they feel that they have some ownership in their own learning, that they feel that they are able to make decisions into their own learning process. I think we'll stop there. Highly recommend, if you haven't already, take a look at Starr's book, Hacking Assessment, 10 Ways to Go Gradeless in a Traditional Grades School. So I want to thank Starr for sharing this information, and I want to thank you for listening, and we'll catch everybody in the next video.